I'm really pleased that we have Jaquita Monroe to lead us off. Jaquita works at the Annie Casey Foundation, where she leads the Juvenile Detention Alternatives Initiative for the Juvenile Justice Strategy Group. We're going to go for about 40 minutes on this one. The speakers will speak for about 5 or 10 minutes apiece, and we'll open it up for questions. And we've got a really super group of people to lead us through it. So, Jaquita, over to you. We'll put you on stage. Please join us. Thank you.
So, good afternoon. Thanks, Steve. I'm so honored to be here. My name, as Steve mentioned, is Jaquita Monroe, and I am a senior associate at the Annie E. Casey Foundation, leading our work around diversion, but also supporting our work on the Juvenile Detention Alternatives Initiative, and as well as our work in ending the youth prison model and working specifically in New Jersey. And so, super excited to be here this afternoon and to be with two rock stars really in the juvenile justice reform kind of arena. And so I first kind of welcome Vinny Schiraldi, which I am sure everyone kind of knows Vinny. Vinny currently is at Columbia and is the co-director of the Columbia Justice Lab. And I believe most of you have received a bio, so I won't go kind of extensively into Vinny's bio, but I'm sure he'll share with us, some of his history in doing this work around juvenile justice reform. And our other panelist, who's joining us on the phone from Chapel Hill, North Carolina, where they're having some strong winds, is Ricky Watson. And Ricky is the executive director at the National Juvenile Justice Network. So, Ricky, are you on with us?
Yes, Jaquita, I'm on. Nice to be with you all this afternoon. Hope everyone's well.
So great. So just, I think, some framing around what we plan to talk about for the next few kind of minutes. We really were thinking about what's the next hill for juvenile justice reform. As many of you may be aware, and some of you may not be aware, in 2018, the Annie E. Casey Foundation released what was our kind of vision for getting juvenile probation right, what probation should look like, understanding that the bulk of young people who kind of engage in the juvenile justice system, they are falling into kind of under the guidance and supervision of probation, and that many of those young people really probably should not be there. And so we released our paper in 2018, and the founding principle of that paper was really on two kind of pillars. And so one pillar was really the shrinking of probation and shrinking it to a point where you were working with young people who kind of had the highest need, who may have committed some serious harm and needed to have more kind of intense interventions, but having intentional and effective interventions. So meaning that it wasn't just about kind of supervising a young person and giving them lots of conditions of probation, but really with creating a program for a young person, meeting their needs, engaging with their family, and wrapping services around that. And in order to kind of shrink the system, probation, to the place where it needed to be, so that probation officers can really hone in on the young people who had the most need, the other pillar of this transformation of probation was around diversion. And that really involved getting as many young people away and redirected from the court as possible, and moving from where traditionally we've seen 40 to 41% of young people being diverted, ideally with the goal of diverting up to 80% of young people, and understanding that most young people who are coming and receiving some type of supervision, whether it's very minimum supervision or it's kind of a higher level of supervision, are not really meeting the criteria for that interaction. And so this is really kind of where we want to take our conversation today. And I'm going to invite Vinny to kind of step in quickly to share with us. Vinny is in the process of writing a book about probation. And Vinny, although I understand it's largely like centered on the adult world of probation, I think we'd be interested to hear like what you're learning in doing this research and how it really, some of the things and the ways that probation was formed for adults has now become applicable to young people, and what that looks like.
Yeah, thanks, Jaquita, and thanks for your nice introduction, and also for having us on, Steve. It's always great to interact in these forums. I think they've been terrific throughout the years. You guys have done a great job, and I'm glad to be on. So, yeah, both, think of the sort of new country forming its responses to crime, and there was a lot of innovation in a lot of areas. We created the first penitentiary and simultaneously in Auburn, New York, and Philadelphia. Juvenile facilities were being created in the 1820s in New York and Boston. Probation was being invented in the US in the 1840s. Parole was being adopted from overseas in the 1870s. So all these sort of things that we now, hold as routine. And then in 1899, the first juvenile court was started in Chicago. These things that we just think of as, of course they existed, a couple of hundred years ago, none of them existed. And they were using stocks and pillory, and kids were adults at the hands of the system. And so they started in the early 1800s, but they really blossomed in the progressive era when there was a real sense that science such that it was, technology such that it was, advances, societal advances could better the human condition. And these were very seemingly well-intentioned, but there was also definitely a measure of social control. It was sort of white people, wealthy white people, mostly women, going into the homes of poor people, mostly, Eastern European and Irish immigrant families. And just by dint of their visitation, there was an expectation that the conditions would improve. So one example of probation's early days, probation is thought to have evolved and expanded from what was called the friendly visiting program. And the sort of mother of the friendly visiting program is a woman named Josephine Shaw Lowell. And what she said about the friendly visiting program is, a constant and continued intercourse must be kept up between those who have a high standard and those who have it not, and that the educated and happy and good are to give some of their time regularly and as a duty, year in and year out, to the ignorant, miserable, and the vicious. So as I said, there were definitely some good intentions here, but you can see, some of the problems that, going into the homes of poor people could have. Interestingly, by the way, we now, we certainly think today of probation as the less intrusive and less punitive alternative to being put in a training school or youth prison. Back then, it wasn't so. Back then, the youth prisons were new. They had these great, helpful names. They were named after their aspirations, the Youth Guidance Center, the Reform School, the Reformatory. They were aspirational places. And so they tended to be full of white kids. And kids of color got the less expensive and less shiny penny. They got probation. So probation was disproportionately kids of color. Juvenile training schools, youth prisons were disproportionately white. And you can see this in the pictures looking back over time. And of course, now that's all flipped. I think, you know, from my research, it's showing that this system of probation was never adequately funded, never adequately staffed. Originally, it was just volunteers. But once the government took it over, it became something that, as Jaquita talked about, lots of people got sentenced to. So it became the dominant sentence, and still is in both adult and juvenile courts. And but was never adequately funded. There was never adequate training. Caseloads mushroomed. It kind of became, in many respects, an alternative to nothing rather than an alternative to incarceration. And we see, for the time periods when both adult and juvenile incarceration rose, probation numbers rose as well. If it was a real alternative, as probation numbers rose, you'd expect incarceration numbers to decline. Now they are declining for juveniles dramatically by more than 2/3. Probation numbers are coming down as well, and crime is coming down. So I don't think there's a clear picture there. The research I've looked at shows that while there are better ways to do probation, and the Casey paper, I think, does a remarkable job of pointing that out, we don't quite know whether it is better to have probation exist or not to have probation exist. And this is something I talked about the last time I was at one of John Jay's forums. So if probation was an evidence-based practice, it wouldn't have enough evidence yet to prove it needs to exist. And I think, you know, I say that, I know that sometimes shocks people and can come across as a little snarky, but I think that in this moment we're in right now with the pandemic and financial crisis, and you know, the Black Lives Matter movement calling for very elemental discussions of and changes to our system, like Michael talked about a little earlier. I think it might be a time for us to examine the nature of probation. Does it need to exist? If so, how should it look? Who should it be for? Who should run it? I think that stuff should all be on the table today.
Thanks, Benny. So with that, totally agree, like we're in a moment, right, where we should be talking about what probation should look like and how effective it is. But we're also kind of in this place of thinking about, when I talked about the pillar of diversion. And so this is really kind of, I want to pose this to both you and Ricky, and thinking about right now we're in this place where we're talking about getting as many young people out of probation, kind of away from the courts as possible, and getting them onto a different path. And so diversion has always been a tough name. It's a tough name. It conjures up, what does that mean? So for many people, it feels like, oh, is the young person going to not be held accountable? And we can point to kind of Los Angeles County, which is right now in the midst of probably one of the most transformative kind of changes that any place has gone through. They are on roll and have a goal to divert up to 80% of their young people away from the court system. And so they started on this process in 2018. They launched in 2019. They're now, I believe, in 8 to 10 departments where they've partnered with police with law enforcement to divert young people. And there's a couple of things that are interesting about what LA County has done in moving towards this path. So the first thing they did is that they created an entire kind of a whole new system of where young people would be diverted. And it's not going through their probation department, but they've actually created the Division of Youth Diversion and Development, and it's sitting within the County of Health Services. So they're taking a much more kind of public health approach to looking at diversion and meeting the needs of young people who may need some intervention, some may need none. The other thing that they're doing is that it's a community-led approach to diversion. So the young person is diverted, they're diverted directly to a community-based organization that kind of picks up the case and provides services. And part of the build into that is that it was essential that they had restorative justice practices as part of their diversion program. And so I'll invite you, Ricky, first to kind of talk about diversion and to discuss the potential pitfalls for a young person when diversion isn't a viable option for them, and the benefits for young people being diverted and being diverted to community-led organizations. So I'll invite you, Ricky, and then I'll invite you, Vinny.
Thanks, Jaquita, and I appreciate Vinny's historical context of probation and the origin of it. As Jaquita did already, she introduced me. My name is Ricky Watson. I'm the Executive Director of the National Juvenile Justice Network, and we lead a network of roughly 60 organizational members and countless allies and advocates across the country that are committed to anti-racist policy and advocacy change to ultimately reshape and reimagine juvenile justice. Our goal is ultimately to educate, inform, and empower others to join in the fight to eliminate racial disparities in the criminal and juvenile system and elevate youth leaders and leaders of color that are doing this work, and to ensure that young people everywhere can really reach their full potential and be free from all the obstacles that the juvenile and criminal system involvement really kind of entails. So with that being said, I really respond best to stories, and I think there's a really important story that I'd like to kind of contextualize myself as an advocate for you all. And this story is one of a young woman by the name of Grace, or that's at least what we're calling her at this point. And she just recently got a lot of national attention earlier this year. Grace was a sophomore at Groves High School in Michigan, and she was ultimately charged with assault and theft in 2019 and placed on probation in about the middle of April. Part of the conditions of her probation was to attend all of her classes and to maintain passing grades, or basically something to that effect. What you should know about Grace is that she's got ADHD, she receives special education services, and ultimately in the midst of this pandemic that we all find ourselves kind of battling and trying to manage right now, she struggled with the transition to online learning. And when schools were forced to go virtual, she struggled and was ultimately violated for not completing her homework online. That violation was brought before the court, and the presiding judge of the family division found that Grace was in violation of her probation for not completing her schoolwork. She was ultimately ordered to juvenile detention. This judge ruled that Grace was ultimately a threat to the community based on that prior charge of assault and theft that she had. And while Grace hadn't really broken any laws during this violation, she found herself locked in a juvenile detention facility in the midst of the pandemic, all for not doing her homework. Something that many children do all the time, and certainly not, a crime. But this is really how easy it is for a child to become a quick victim of the juvenile system and probation more specifically. And this is one of the ways that the cycle of overcriminalization of children really kind of snowballs. And, in regular times when a child's removed from their community and from their home and placed in a detention center, they lose access to all those ties in the community that many of us advocates know is what's going to be the real key to success for a child. Kids in facilities typically don't get the same level of resources, and they don't have the same classes. They don't have the same therapy. They're away from their families. They're away from the people that we believe they need to be closest to in their moment of need. Just consider, how much more an incarcerated child, was having to deal with or would have to deal with in the midst of this pandemic and in the midst of everything going on. And I wanted to share with you all Grace's story because unfortunately it's not a unique case. And in full candor, as a former public defender, I've had many clients come in for far less than what Grace was originally accused of doing. And what you find is that in juvenile court, parents come to court. Parents can speak. And what you find sometimes is there are problems at home. And typically those problems are normal teenager problems and kid problems, from talking back to not doing chores to not listening when they've been asked to do something. And when judges hear about these problems and determine that a child really needs to be kept under the jurisdiction of a court to ensure that they receive, adequate services and supervision, things like this happen all the time. And what the real issue is and what the real problem is that judges' hands are tied by the laws oftentimes, and they lack the opportunity or access to different community-based alternatives that go beyond juvenile court and probation. And that's what happens. So when we talk about opportunities and what it looks like in the future for diversion, what comes to my mind is really a program here that I've worked really closely with, and I'm in Chapel Hill, but I've worked all across the state of North Carolina, and I've worked really closely with the Durham Misdemeanor Diversion Program. And the director of that program, it initially began as one that was meant to operate as kind of a stopgap for the state of North Carolina. We were criminalizing young people between the ages of 16 and 17 as adults because we hadn't raised the age. And so Durham decided as a community that they wanted to do something about that, recognizing all the collateral consequences that go along with being involved in the adult system, particularly in a state like North Carolina at the time, but just any court involvement, whether it's juvenile or criminal, in adult court. So they came up with a solution, and that was a pre-arrest and pre-charge program that allowed for officers to ultimately refer children to programs only if they were about to arrest or about to charge a kid with a crime. So ultimately, it was a stopgap that was created that they've ultimately effectively built out into a really nice program that has been extended into ages that go beyond 16 and 17-year-olds. That's one example of what I think diversion can look like. And obviously, we're going to hear more about some other examples, but I think it's really important to stress that it's really critical that communities have weigh-in and ownership of whatever diversionary programs or opportunities are going to be afforded to young people in their communities.
Thanks, Ricky. Vinny, did you want to chime in? And then I'm going to get some questions out of the Q&A box for you guys as well.
Yeah, I mean, I was head of probation under the Bloomberg administration, and we had in New York City probation about 30,000 people on it. There are about 3,000 of whom were juveniles, the rest were adults, and I had both. And we, when we started, and this is also happens to address one of the questions that got asked as well. Right when we started, luckily for us, the state funds had just paid for an examination of racial disparities in the juvenile system in New York at every stage of the system. And so right when I started, it was revealed that there were racial disparities at the diversion stage even when you controlled for prior arrest and current offense, which are the two relevant things to be looking at the diversion stage. And in New York, it's different. Diversion is different in different places. Sometimes probation has the power to do the diversion. Sometimes prosecutors have the power to do diversion. Sometimes it's shared. Sometimes it's judicial. So it's different in different places. In New York City with probation, you have wide discretion over diversion. In DC, probation, which I was not, I ran juvenile corrections in DC. It was a separate probation department. Them and the prosecutor shared the diversionary decision. So this was squarely on my department. The racial disparities that we were seeing, and so we did a lot of things to expand diversion. But the way the Bloomberg administration worked, we were constantly having meetings and presentations internally with system stakeholders, so the cops, but not with the community, but with the system folks. So all the executive branch people used to meet regularly to discuss who was doing what. And I always made it a point to sit next to the NYPD representative, because I knew if I was going to crash on any rocks, it was going to be the rock of NYPD. So I always wanted to make sure that guy wasn't, going off the reservation. And so we presented our data. It was a very substantial increase in the number of kids being diverted. And we had discretion to divert violent offenses. Robberies that was a big thing that kids got arrested for. So we had quite a few diversions in the robbery category when I made the presentation. And I'm not going to name him, but if you look up NYPD cop in the dictionary, they had a picture of this guy. He was the guy, right? And sat right next to me, and he said, "Vinny, my head's gonna explode." And it was this big Irish cop, and his head was flaming red when he was saying it to me. We're chasing these robbery cases down, and you're diverting them. They don't even get to court. They literally give the kid a family court appearance ticket, and he sits across the desk with one of my POs, and that's it. It just wasn't enough for this guy. And I said, "No, take it easy. Come down to my office. I will take you through every case we diverted in the last month, and you tell me if any of these cases should have been forwarded to the court. And most of them were, give me your lunch money, give me your, today's version, when I was in school, it was give me your lunch money. Today's version of give me your lunch money is give me your iPad or your iPhone, which is considerably more expensive than your lunch money, but it's still the same functional act from a kid. These weren't pistol whippings of old people in dark alleys. And every single time we had to ask the victim, that was part of the law, if they were okay with the diversion. So none of them were diverted without victim permission. And we had data on their outcomes, and their outcomes were ever so slightly better than just putting them on regular probation. It wasn't like a dramatic change. 90% of them did fine, but not because we did anything particularly fantastic, but because they were, at the shallow end of the pool. And at the shallow end of the pool, you kind of shouldn't do anything with kids because our systems have a much better chance of screwing them up than making them better. So not only should we not have locked them up, we shouldn't even have put them on probation because 90% of the times they did fine. And so he saw that and he actually was cool with it. He couldn't say that he really objected to any of those. But had it not been for that kick in the rear end that we got from the research done by the Hayward Burns Institute and the Vera Institute, we, that was a good nudge to up the number of kids we were adjusting. They called it adjustment, but it's essentially diversion.
And Jaquita, if I could just add, I want to echo that, I think Vinny's 100% right about the need for that data collection piece to kind of really know what you're working with and what changes need to be made. And, I'm using the Durham Misdemeanor Diversion Program as a case study here today. And, one of the pieces that we have to be sure to address is really that access point. Who is being afforded the access to these types of diversionary programs? One of the biggest issues with the Durham MVP initially when it was really getting started was the question of whether officer discretion was going to be in play in terms of if they had to use the program or not, or if they had the option to use it, or if they could, in their discretion, actually charge a kid. And leaving that up to officer discretion or making it mandatory was really a sticking point for some time. And in Durham and other counties in North Carolina, what we found early on was that law enforcement and the ones who were actually tasked with sending those referrals for the program weren't evenly offering the opportunity to participate in that program, that diversionary program. And white kids would ultimately receive the benefit of that program, and black children were still being referred to court. This led Durham to really make it a requirement for law enforcement to use the misdemeanor diversion program for all youth that were accused of committing a misdemeanor initially. And while there were times when children would fall through the cracks and get referred, of course, the data collection piece was really critical in improving outcomes for youth of color who hadn't initially received the same benefits of a diversionary program. So access and application of opportunities for diversion really need to be codified, and discretion needs to be removed from the equation at all possible. And I think data collection is really important to track those racial disparities and other missed opportunities and access issues.
Thanks, Ricky.
You asked that question, so you've heard about New York City and Durham. That is the research on diversion. Kids tend to do well on it. It tends to help them avoid being sucked into the system and labeling and self-identifying as criminals. But the knock on diversion is it's typically meted out in a racially disparate manner, even more so than the rest of the system. It's especially prone to that because decisions are made behind closed doors. There's not a lot of advocacy involved. At least in court, kids of color have a defender who's trying to fight on their behalf. But these are such broadly discretionary decisions that they tend to skew to the benefit of white kids. And I definitely agree with what Ricky said in terms of trying to reduce that discretion so it's fairly applied across racial and ethnic categories.
So I think we got to Eddie's question, which was asking about racial disparities in youth having access to diversion programs. So thank you both, Vinny and Ricky, for really digging into that. I did want to, we have a question from Ronald Burler, who's asking, which I think this is really important when we talk about like probation and conditions of probation. So Ronald's asking, like bail, probation can often appear arbitrary. Is there a rhyme or reason to assigning a period of probation, particularly in regard to youth? And so maybe Vinny, this is a good place for you to dig in about kind of period of probation, how it gets assigned, and then Ricky just talking us through like conditions of probation and how both of these things combine to drag kids deeper into the system, which again leads us back to talking about diversion and why we should be moving whole groups of young people out of this, away from the courts from the beginning.
Sure.
Yeah, and I'm gonna touch on Cheryl's question because it was above Ronald's in the queue because they also kind of fit together. And hi Cheryl, how you doing? It's been a while. There hasn't. So if you went back to the 80s and stacked up probation research to incarceration research to the early 80s, they were kind of running neck and neck. Probation and parole research to prison and jail research. And then just mass incarceration just started to grow and become such a focus of elected officials, the media, and researchers were drawn into that. And so a lot of the energy behind answering some kind of tough and interesting questions about probation and parole migrated to mass incarceration because it was just such a fat target. And so we don't know quite as much as I think we wish we did about this sentence that is meted out more frequently than any other. And you know, there are twice as many people in America on probation and parole as are incarcerated. And that's grown right alongside mass incarceration to become mass supervision. There are more people under supervision today than live in most states. We know, I think, terribly little about it. It is arbitrary. It's very, very discretionary. And I think that's part of the problem. Too often, it's given as an alternative to nothing. The system really has a difficult time doing nothing or doing little. Especially the juvenile system, because it's founded on these notions of rehabilitation. So it feels like it should be interventionist. It feels like it should parent the kids. And literally, it is based on a notion of the state as the child's parens patriae, or in loco parentis, in the place of the parent. So the juvenile court system very much feels a guardianship relationship with the kids it interacts with. And that's complicated even further, as Michael was talking about a little earlier, by the fact that many of the judges cross back and forth. You're much more likely to have been a child welfare judge and a juvenile justice judge than a juvenile justice judge and a criminal justice judge. You don't tend to go from criminal to juvenile. You tend to go from juvenile to child welfare in the same family court. And the child welfare system is very clearly endeavoring to sort of replace the parents, or can be endeavoring to replace the parents. So that washes over into the juvenile system very frequently. And sometimes judges put people on probation and kids on probation when they shouldn't. It's not always beneficial. Many times the kid needs something very, very light touch for a very, very short period of time. Many times just going to court scares them enough to be enough. There was one random assignment study, and you don't get a lot of random assignment studies in courts because you're talking about people's liberty interests. But somebody, researcher in Hawaii, convinced the judges to randomly assign kids. The researcher told me about it. He was having this argument with a judge who insisted that it's that judicial lecture. When I bring a kid into court and I give them a lecture, they tell me, I've had kids run into me years later and tell me how that changed their lives. And the researcher said, that is abject nonsense. you run into 1 in a million kids who remembered your speech, and the other 999,000 forgot all about you the minute they left your courtroom. It makes no difference. So the judge allowed him to randomly assign, and so they randomly assigned kids on burglary cases to a judicial lecture, in essence, virtually nothing, which was like basically a letter home to their parents. Your kid got arrested, make sure it doesn't happen again. And then normal court processing, which most frequently resulted in a probationary sentence. And there was no statistical difference between the three. So it's my view of that is if you can have no difference by not depriving someone of their liberty, even in a demi-deprivation that probation represents, and it does represent a deprivation of liberty, even though it's not a full deprivation of liberty like jail or prison. If you can get the same result by doing that as you can by sending a letter home to their mother, you should send a letter home to their mother.
So I'm going to just switch up just a little bit because we have 5 minutes left. And there are some questions that we didn't get to, but we will, I believe Steve will send them to us and we can answer them after the session. Vinny and Ricky, I'm sure will be willing to respond to any questions that we didn't get to. But I do want to just, and this is for you, Ricky, and then I'm going to wrap up. There's a question from Anna Brugman that just talks about the research suggesting that diversion works for young people and why it's so difficult to implement. Then why is it so difficult to implement diversion programs for young people? What are some of the hurdles to getting stakeholders to embrace reform? And so coming from an advocacy group, I'd love for you to kind of tackle that.
Yeah, I mean, I've got something I'd like to say in response to some of what Vinny had. I think he had some great points, but why do systems generally want to maintain themselves, right? Why do systems need to continue to exist in the ways that they have without consideration for whether they're effective or not? I think, as with all systems that we're operating in, the probationary system is one that relies upon bodies and people, and ultimately that's what people, feel like they need to be doing. And, these places have created these huge budgets with huge staff, and people need something to do, right? And that supervision is what they're doing. And, I think ultimately what we need in our juvenile systems is more creativity. You think about a kid who skips school. You think about what the punishment for that is. And, obviously the parents can maybe even be arrested or charged and then, go to court for truancy. But instead of, taking that child away from school and bringing them into a juvenile system where they have to go to court and where they're not in school and, not in the place that they actually said they didn't want to be in, maybe we should figure out a way to increase their time in school. Maybe we should be sending them to Saturday or Sunday school. I went to a high school where we had that. If you were caught skipping class, that's what happened to you. You went to Sunday school or Saturday school. I think we really have to also go back to old school. We have to think back to the days when law enforcement didn't exist inside of a classroom or a school. Back when, and I know this because I hear it all the time from my dad, issues were handled within the community. Everybody in the community was invested in the success of a child, and children were held accountable by those who cared for them and looked out for them. Of course, times have changed and communities change, but with adequate resources and appropriate therapeutic programs, I think we can really return to a time where that community interest is prioritized. And I really think we should do more of that. And I think ultimately, youth interaction with court systems should be limited and reserved for the most violent of offenses, period. Many studies have found that the deeper a child, goes and gets involved in the juvenile or criminal system, the more ingrained they become with that system and they're more likely to recidivate. So we really have to understand, and I think we really need to reshape the notion of what juvenile justice looks like, because it clearly comes from a paternalistic place, right? It comes from a place that says parents don't necessarily know, right, what's best for their children. And it doesn't address the issues of lack of resources. It doesn't address the issue of parents not being able to do the best for their kids because they don't have the appropriate resources and the environment isn't right. So I think we really have to be asking ourselves the bigger picture issues and seeing deeper than just, whatever any case might happen to be in the news or whatever headlines we might happen to see. We have to be thinking about what people need to be successful. And, we really have to be mindful of just access to basic needs for a lot of the kids that we're talking about, right? When kids are worried about their next meal, when kids don't have appropriate or adequate access to healthcare, when the water that they're drinking from is poisoned, and when they live in a food desert and they have no internet access. Those are things that we need to be thinking about in terms of what it really takes for a child to be successful. And we need to be putting resources into these communities to ensure that people have the opportunity to be successful.
Thank you, Ricky. I see Steve is back. I think he's looking at me to wrap up, and I just want to thank both Vinny and Ricky. This has been a really fruitful conversation. We probably could have used some more time. So we will get the questions, and we'll get answers to you as well.
Right, I'll echo that. Thank you, Jaquita. That was great, and Vinny and Ricky. Ricky, thank you for getting to us on the phone. I hope things are okay down there, and that you survived.
It will be okay.
You survived the onslaught. But thanks again. Thanks again to both of you. We're going to take another 10-minute break, and we'll be back with our next panel, which will be on the tracking the movement for youth incarceration, which is continuation of the same. But again, thank you to both of our panelists, especially to Jaquita. And stay tuned to our conference page where we will put up questions and answers as well as other materials that come out through the sessions. And I hope you guys will stay with us for the afternoon. It's raining, so not much else to do today.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you
Thanks
all.
a lot.
Thanks. Bye.
Okay.
Take care. Thank you, guys.
We'll take a 10-minute break.